What if the future of your life after 70 isn't written in your genes, but quietly revealed in the small choices you make every single day? There comes a quiet moment in life, often unnoticed, when a person begins to draw invisible lines between what feels familiar and what feels foreign. After 70, these lines can become walls if one is not careful. Change starts to look less like an invitation and more like an intrusion. New ideas, new tools, new ways of communicating. These things can feel like disruptions to a rhythm that took decades to build. And so, many people begin to protect themselves from discomfort by holding tightly to what they already know. But in doing so, they also begin to limit the flow of life that continues to move around them. Because life does not pause to accommodate our preferences. It continues forward, asking only one question: are you willing to move with me? To resist change is not simply to reject something external, it is to slowly disconnect from the present moment. A person who says, "This is not for me anymore," may believe they are preserving their identity, but in reality, they are narrowing it. The world evolves, and when we refuse to evolve alongside it, we begin to feel like strangers in a place that was once our home. This sense of disconnection does not happen suddenly. It creeps in gently, disguised as comfort, disguised as routine. Yet beneath that comfort lies a subtle stagnation, a quiet stillness that is not peaceful but dormant. And dormancy, when prolonged, begins to resemble the early stages of giving up on life without ever consciously deciding to do so. On the other hand, there are those who approach change with a different posture, not with certainty, but with openness. They do not pretend that learning something new is easy. They do not deny the frustration of feeling slow or unfamiliar with things that others seem to grasp quickly. But they allow themselves to experience that discomfort without turning away from it. They remain curious. They ask questions even when the answers seem obvious to others. They try, fail, laugh at themselves, and try again. In this process, something remarkable happens. They maintain a living connection with the world as it is now, not as it used to be, and this connection becomes a source of vitality. Curiosity in this stage of life is not about acquiring knowledge for practical gain. It is about sustaining a relationship with existence itself. When you remain curious, you are silently affirming that there is still something for you to discover, still something that can surprise you, still something that can expand you. And this affirmation carries a kind of energy that goes beyond the mind. It influences how you move, how you speak, how you engage with others. It keeps your inner world active, flexible, responsive. In contrast, when curiosity fades, rigidity takes its place, and rigidity has a way of making time feel heavier, slower, less generous. There is also a deeper layer to this relationship with change, one that touches identity. Many people spend their lives becoming someone, building roles, responsibilities, and ways of being that define them. After 70, some of these roles begin to dissolve, careers end, children become independent, social circles shift. Change, in this sense, is not just external, it becomes deeply personal. And here lies a profound choice: to cling to an identity that no longer fits, or to allow oneself to be reshaped. Those who choose the latter often experience a surprising sense of freedom. Without the pressure to prove or achieve, they can explore parts of themselves that were previously neglected. This willingness to be reshaped requires humility. It asks you to admit that you do not know everything, that you are still capable of growth, that your story is not finished. And while this may feel uncomfortable at first, it is also what keeps life open. Because as long as you are open to change, you remain open to possibility. And possibility is the quiet force that keeps the future alive within you. There is a particular kind of silence that begins to appear in life after 70. It is not always loud or dramatic. In fact, It often hides behind routine, behind television, behind the familiar rhythm of days that pass without interruption. But within that silence, something essential is at stake: the sense of being connected to others. Because human life, no matter how independent it may appear, has always been woven through relationships. And when those threads begin to loosen, a person may not immediately notice the loss, but they will feel its weight over time. Many people assume that loneliness is simply the absence of others, but it is far more subtle than that. You can be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. You can have conversations that fill the air but leave the heart untouched. True connection is not measured by how many voices you hear in a day, but by how deeply you feel seen, heard, and understood. After 70, this depth becomes more important than ever. Superficial interactions may pass the time, but they do not nourish the spirit, and without nourishment, something within begins to withdraw, quietly and almost imperceptibly. Those who continue to build and maintain meaningful connections often do something that others hesitate to do. They make the effort to reach out. They initiate conversations. They ask questions that go beyond politeness. They listen not to respond, but to understand. This kind of presence cannot be faked, and it cannot be replaced by convenience. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to be emotionally available. And yet, it is precisely this investment that keeps relationships alive and in turn keeps the individual engaged with life itself. There is also a certain courage involved in staying connected. With age comes loss: friends who move away, loved ones who pass on, relationships that change or fade. Each loss can create a quiet hesitation, a reluctance to form new bonds out of fear that they too will eventually disappear. And so, some people begin to close themselves off, believing that it is safer not to attach, not to depend, not to open up again. But in protecting themselves from potential pain, they also distance themselves from one of the most vital sources of meaning in life. Others choose a different path. They acknowledge the pain of loss, but they do not allow it to define their future. They remain open to new connections, even if those connections look different from what they once knew. They find companionship in unexpected places: neighbors, community groups, shared activities, even brief but genuine interactions with strangers. They understand that connection is not about permanence, it is about presence. It is about showing up fully in the moments that are available rather than withdrawing in anticipation of what might be lost. An important aspect of connection after 70 is the balance between giving and receiving. Some people struggle with the idea of needing others, seeing it as a sign of weakness or decline. They prefer to remain self-sufficient, even when it leads to isolation. But connection is not a one-way exchange. It is a dynamic relationship where both giving and receiving have equal value. Allowing oneself to be supported, to be cared for, to be listened to, these are not signs of fragility, they are expressions of trust. And trust, once established, creates a sense of belonging that strengthens the will to remain engaged with life. At the same time, offering something of yourself, your time, your attention, your experience, reinforces the feeling that you still have a place in the world. It reminds you that your presence matters, that your voice carries weight, that your existence continues to influence others in meaningful ways. This sense of contribution does not have to be grand or visible to many. Even the smallest acts of kindness or understanding can create a ripple effect that extends far beyond what you can see. In the end, the depth of your connections shapes not only how you experience life, but how life responds to you. When you remain emotionally engaged, when you continue to invest in relationships, you create an environment where meaning can thrive. And in that environment, the passage of time feels less like something that is slipping away and more like something that is still unfolding, still offering moments of connection that make each day worth stepping into. At a certain point in life, the idea of purpose begins to change its form. In earlier years, it often arrives dressed as ambition, goals to achieve, positions to reach, responsibilities to fulfill. It is tied to movement, to progress, to the visible markers of success that the world recognizes and rewards. But after 70, many of these external structures begin to fade or lose their urgency. The roles that once defined a person, professional titles, social expectations, daily obligations, gradually loosen their grip, and in their place, a quieter, more intimate question emerges. What gives meaning to my days now? For some, this transition feels disorienting. Without the familiar framework of responsibilities, time can begin to feel empty, even heavy. Days stretch longer, not because there is more life in them, but because there is less direction. It is in this space that many people begin to confuse rest with purposelessness. They believe that having nothing urgent to do is a reward, something they have earned after years of effort. And while rest is necessary, when it becomes the dominant rhythm of life, it can slowly erode the sense of engagement. Without something to move toward, even in the smallest sense, a person may begin to feel as though they are simply passing time rather than inhabiting it. Yet purpose does not disappear with age, it transforms. It becomes less about proving something to the world and more about expressing something essential within oneself. It may no longer be loud or visible, but it carries a depth that was not always present before. A person may find purpose in tending to a garden, not for productivity, but for the quiet satisfaction of nurturing life. Another may find it in sharing stories, passing down lessons that cannot be found in books. There are those who discover meaning in acts of care, in being present for others in ways that are steady and reliable rather than grand or dramatic. What distinguishes those who maintain a strong sense of purpose is not the scale of what they do, but the intention behind it. They do not wait for purpose to be assigned to them. They create it through their attention and their choices. They recognize that meaning is not something that arrives fully formed. It is something that grows through engagement. Even the simplest actions, when approached with awareness, can become significant. Preparing a meal, taking a walk, engaging in conversation, these moments, when experienced fully, carry a quiet sense of direction that keeps life from becoming hollow. There is also a subtle but important shift in how purpose is experienced internally. In earlier stages of life, it is often linked to outcomes, success, recognition, completion. After 70, it becomes more about the process itself. The act of doing becomes as valuable as the result, sometimes even more so. This shift allows for a different kind of freedom, one that is not constrained by expectations or deadlines. A person can engage in activities for the simple reason that they bring a sense of fulfillment, without needing them to lead anywhere specific. And in this freedom, purpose becomes less rigid and more fluid, adapting to the rhythms of each day. Another dimension of purpose at this stage is the relationship between memory and legacy. Many individuals begin to reflect on the lives they have lived, the choices they have made, the paths they have taken. This reflection can either lead to a sense of closure or to a feeling of incompleteness, depending on how it is approached. Those who remain connected to purpose tend to view their past not as something that defines them entirely, but as something that informs what they still have to offer. They see their experiences as resources, sources of insight, understanding, and empathy that can be shared with others. This sharing does not always take a formal shape. It may occur in conversations, in quiet moments of guidance, in the way one listens or responds. But through it, a person continues to contribute to the world, reinforcing the idea that their presence still carries meaning. And this sense of contribution becomes a powerful motivator, encouraging continued engagement with life. It creates a loop in which purpose feeds action, and action reinforces purpose, sustaining a dynamic that keeps time from feeling empty or repetitive. The relationship with purpose after 70 is not about finding something extraordinary to do, but about recognizing the value of what is already within reach and choosing to engage with it fully. There is a conversation that never stops, a quiet dialogue that follows you through every stage of life. It does not require words spoken aloud, yet it shapes the way you interpret everything around you. After 70, this inner voice often becomes more pronounced, not because it grows louder, but because there is more space to hear it. The distractions that once filled the day begin to fade, and what remains is the tone you use with yourself when no one else is listening. It is in this space that a subtle but powerful influence takes hold, one that can either expand your experience of life or quietly begin to limit it. For many, this voice becomes increasingly restrictive over time. It starts with small phrases that seem harmless, almost reasonable. I am too old to try that. It is not worth the effort anymore. That part of my life is over. These thoughts are often accepted without question because they appear logical, even protective. They promise safety, comfort, and the avoidance of unnecessary struggle. But beneath that surface, they carry an unspoken message that growth is no longer possible, that exploration is no longer appropriate, that the future has little left to offer. And when these messages are repeated often enough, they begin to form a narrative that feels real, shaping behavior in ways that reinforce their own truth. What makes this internal dialogue particularly influential is its familiarity. It feels like a natural extension of one's identity, something that has always been there. But in reality, it is shaped by years of experiences, beliefs, and external influences that have been internalized over time. After 70, when new experiences may become less frequent, there is a tendency for this voice to rely more heavily on the past, repeating patterns that were formed long ago. Without awareness, it can become rigid, offering the same responses to different situations, limiting the possibility of seeing things in a new light. Yet there are those who develop a different relationship with this inner voice. Instead of allowing it to operate automatically, they begin to observe it with a certain distance. They notice the phrases that arise, the assumptions that are made, the tone that is used, and in that observation, they create a space for choice. They may still hear the thought, I am too old for this, but they do not accept it as a final truth. They question it gently, sometimes even with a sense of humor. They ask themselves whether it is a reflection of reality or simply a habit of thinking that has gone unchallenged for too long. This shift from identification to awareness transforms the role of the inner voice. It no longer dictates experience, it becomes part of it. And with this shift comes the possibility of cultivating a different tone, one that is more supportive, more patient, more open. This does not mean replacing every negative thought with forced positivity, but rather introducing a sense of balance. Acknowledging limitations without exaggerating them, recognizing fears without surrendering to them, allowing uncertainty without turning it into avoidance. There is also a deeper layer to this internal dialogue, one that relates to how a person treats themselves emotionally. Over time, many individuals become harsher with themselves, holding on to regrets, mistakes, or missed opportunities. The inner voice may replay past decisions, emphasizing what could have been done differently, creating a quiet undercurrent of dissatisfaction. This kind of self-talk can be particularly heavy after 70, when there is a natural inclination to look back and evaluate one's life. If this reflection is guided by criticism alone, it can lead to a sense of incompleteness, as though something essential was missed or lost. Others approach this reflection with a different attitude. They allow themselves to acknowledge imperfections without turning them into judgments. They recognize that every stage of life was lived with the understanding they had at the time. This perspective introduces a sense of compassion into the inner dialogue, softening its tone and allowing for a more balanced view of the past. Instead of being trapped in what cannot be changed, they use their reflections as a source of insight, something that can still inform how they experience the present. The way you speak to yourself also influences how you engage with the world externally. A voice that is critical and limiting tends to create hesitation, reducing the willingness to try new things or connect with others. In contrast, a voice that is encouraging and flexible fosters a sense of possibility, making it easier to step into unfamiliar situations without excessive fear. This connection between inner dialogue and outward behavior is often subtle, but its impact accumulates over time, shaping the overall experience of life in ways that are both profound and enduring. There is a quiet conversation that takes place between a person and their body, one that does not rely on words but is expressed through movement, sensation, and attention. After 70, this conversation becomes more noticeable, not because the body suddenly changes, but because its signals become harder to ignore. Stiffness, fatigue, and limitations may begin to appear with greater frequency, and in response, many people start to withdraw from physical activity. They move less, sit more, and gradually begin to treat the body as something fragile, something to be protected rather than engaged. What often goes unnoticed is that this withdrawal, though seemingly cautious, can accelerate the very decline it seeks to avoid. The body is not designed for stillness, it is designed for participation. Even in later years, it responds to use with a kind of quiet resilience. Movement does not have to be intense or demanding to be meaningful. A simple walk, a gentle stretch, the act of standing up and sitting down with awareness, these are small gestures, yet they carry significant impact. They remind the body that it is still part of an active life, that it is still being called upon to function, to support, to engage. And in response, the body often adapts, maintaining strength and flexibility in ways that are directly influenced by how it is used. For those who remain physically engaged, there is often a shift in perspective that goes beyond discipline or routine. They do not move because they are trying to resist aging. They move because they recognize that movement itself is a form of connection. It connects them to their environment, to their own sensations, to the present moment. Walking through a space, feeling the ground beneath their feet, noticing the rhythm of their breath, these experiences create a sense of presence that cannot be achieved through stillness alone. The body in motion becomes a bridge between the internal and external worlds, reinforcing the feeling of being alive in a tangible way. There is also an emotional dimension to physical engagement that is often overlooked. When a person moves regularly, even in simple ways, they tend to experience a subtle shift in mood and perception. The act of moving can release tension, create a sense of accomplishment, and introduce a rhythm to the day that supports mental clarity. In contrast, prolonged inactivity can lead to a kind of heaviness, not only in the body but in the mind as well. This heaviness may not be immediately recognized as a consequence of physical stillness, but over time it can influence motivation, energy levels, and overall outlook on life. Another important aspect is the relationship a person has with their own body. After 70, it is common to focus on what the body can no longer do, comparing present abilities to those of earlier years. This comparison often leads to frustration or disappointment, creating a sense of separation between the individual and their physical self. The body becomes something that has failed, something that no longer meets expectations. But this perspective overlooks the remarkable fact that the body has carried the individual through decades of experiences, adapting continuously to changing circumstances. Those who maintain a healthier relationship with their body tend to shift their focus from loss to appreciation. They acknowledge limitations, but they do not define themselves by them. Instead of asking, "What can I no longer do?" they begin to ask, "What can I still do? And how can I do it with care?" This change in perspective transforms physical activity from a measure of performance into an act of respect. Each movement becomes a way of honoring the body's ongoing presence, rather than testing its boundaries against an ideal that no longer applies. There is also a practical element to staying physically engaged that directly influences independence. The ability to perform daily tasks, walking, carrying objects, maintaining balance, is closely tied to continued movement. When these abilities are maintained, a person retains a greater sense of autonomy, which in turn supports confidence and self-sufficiency. Losing these abilities, on the other hand, can lead to increased reliance on others, which may affect not only practical aspects of life, but also emotional well-being. Physical engagement does not require perfection, nor does it demand consistency without interruption. It allows for fluctuations, for days of rest, for moments when energy is low. What matters is the overall relationship, a willingness to return to movement, to re-engage, to treat the body not as an obstacle, but as a partner in the experience of living. There is a subtle shift that can occur in a person's emotional landscape over time, especially after 70, where joy begins to feel less accessible, not because it has disappeared, but because the permission to feel it has quietly diminished. Many people, without realizing it, begin to place conditions on their happiness. They tell themselves that joy belongs to certain moments, certain achievements, or certain stages of life that have already passed. It becomes something that must be justified, something that needs a reason. And in the absence of those reasons, they allow their days to settle into a neutral tone, neither deeply unhappy nor truly alive. This hesitation toward joy is often rooted in habit rather than intention. Over the years, responsibilities, challenges, and disappointments can shape the way a person relates to positive emotions. There may be an unconscious belief that joy is fleeting, that it will inevitably be followed by loss, or that it is no longer appropriate at a certain age. These beliefs are rarely examined directly. They operate quietly, influencing behavior in small but consistent ways. A person may decline an invitation not because they do not want to go, but because it feels easier to stay within the boundaries of what is familiar. They may avoid new experiences, not out of fear alone, but out of a subtle sense that excitement no longer belongs to them. Yet joy does not depend on age, nor does it require grand circumstances. It exists in simple, often overlooked moments. The warmth of sunlight on the skin, the sound of a familiar melody, the comfort of a shared glance with someone who understands without words. These moments do not demand effort in the traditional sense. They ask only for attention. But attention itself can become limited when the mind is preoccupied with routine or when it has grown accustomed to filtering out anything that does not serve a practical purpose. In this way, joy is not absent, it is unnoticed. Those who continue to experience joy in later years often do something very simple, yet very intentional. They allow themselves to notice. They pause even briefly to take in what is present. They do not rush past small pleasures in search of something more significant. Instead, they recognize that significance is often found in the accumulation of these small experiences. A cup of tea, a quiet morning, a conversation that lingers, these are not trivial events, but opportunities to reconnect with a sense of aliveness that does not depend on external validation. There is also an element of openness that plays a role in the experience of joy. To feel joy, one must be willing to be affected by the world, to let something in without immediately analyzing or dismissing it. This openness can feel unfamiliar after years of prioritizing control or predictability. It requires a certain vulnerability, a willingness to step outside of emotional habits that may have become comfortable but limiting. And yet, it is precisely this openness that allows for moments of genuine delight to emerge, often in ways that cannot be anticipated or planned. Another important aspect is the relationship between joy and self-perception. Some individuals begin to see themselves as observers rather than participants in life, as though their role has shifted from experiencing to merely witnessing. This perspective can create a distance between the individual and the moments that could bring them happiness. They may watch others laugh, engage, and explore, while remaining on the periphery, convinced that their time for such experiences has passed. But this belief is not a reflection of reality, it is a narrative that has been accepted without question. Those who remain connected to joy tend to challenge this narrative, not through force, but through gentle action. They participate, even in small ways. They allow themselves to engage in activities that bring pleasure, regardless of how they may be perceived. They laugh without measuring whether it is appropriate. They explore without needing a specific outcome. They embrace moments of lightness without attaching them to a larger purpose. In doing so, they reaffirm their place within the flow of life, not as distant observers, but as active participants. Joy, in this sense, becomes less about intensity and more about continuity. It is not a peak experience that must be chased, but a thread that can run quietly through everyday life. When this thread is maintained, it influences how time is experienced. Days feel less repetitive, moments carry more depth, and the passage of time becomes something that is lived rather than endured.